Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Craig Burrell, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Warrant Officer Class 1, Joanne Davey. We warmly welcome the family of Lance Corporal Joseph Henry Littlefair, whose story will be told shortly. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by family, visitors to the memorial and students on behalf of North Albany Senior High School, Western Australia. If you're able, please stand and join in singing the National Anthem. Students, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn their loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the hearts of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Lance Corporal Joseph Henry Littlefair, who was killed while fighting on the Western Front during the First World War. Joseph Littlefair was born in December 1890 in the Newcastle suburb of Merewether, one of 5 children born to Joseph and Sarah Littlefair. Known to his friends and family as Harry, he worked as a coal miner. Harry joined the 3rd Australian Infantry Battalion of the Australian Imperial Force on the 30th of August 1915 at nearby Maitland. Most of the 3rd Battalion were men recruited from his home state of New South Wales. He sailed for Egypt from Sydney on the transport Austerley in January 1916. After completing further training at the Australian camp in Egypt, Harry joined his unit in France in June 1916. In June and early July, Harry and the 3rd Battalion undertook training with bayonets and other weapons. Although they were in a reserve position, the men of the battalion came under German shell fire and experienced a number of gas alerts that required the men to don their gas masks. In July 1916, the 3rd Battalion marched to the River Somme, where their objective was to take the high ground of the village of Pozières. British commanders believed that the high ground near this village was the key to the entire Somme sector of the Western Front. On the 2nd of July, the day before the advance on Pozières, the men of the 3rd Battalion began to assemble in the assembly trenches. While moving into this forward position, Harry was shot in the chest and badly wounded. He spent 3 weeks at a field hospital in Canberra on the coast of France before being evacuated to hospital in England in August. He recuperated in England for nearly a year. Finally, in July 1917, Harry was able to rejoin his battalion in France. He was promoted to Lance Corporal in the field in September. The 3rd Battalion was now stationed at Kemmel in western Belgium, not far from the French border. As the cold weather began to set in, the troops continued training to maintain discipline. Sport was one way to maintain fitness and camaraderie. In December, a team made up of the men of the 3rd Battalion played football against a team made up of the officers. It was a resounding victory for the rank and file soldiers, who beat the officers 11-0. The winter was cold and wet. In early January, Harry was admitted to hospital suffering from septic heel, brought on by the constant damp. He recovered quickly and returned to his battalion on the 22nd of January. From then until the end of the month, he and the other men of his battalion were on the front line, about 10 kilometres south of the Belgian town of Ypres. After they were relieved, Harry had a fortnight's leave in England. When he returned to his unit on the 2nd of April, winter was over and the Germans had begun a major attack that became known as the German Spring Offensive. The 3rd Battalion travelled by train from the French city of Amiens to the northern city of Strzelecki. This village was a strategic point in the defence against the German offensive, which centred on the River Lys in Flanders. On the 14th of April, Australians in the trenches at Strzelecki could see the Germans assembling in preparation for an attack. At 6:40 in the morning, the Germans began a heavy bombardment of the British and Commonwealth lines and waves of German infantry began advancing. Over the next 48 hours, the Australian troops were successful in repelling the attack on the village of Strzelecki. During the fighting on the 15th of April 1918, Harry was hit by machine gun fire and killed. He was 27 years old. Due to the nature of the fighting, his body was buried where he fell, and today the location of his grave is unknown. His name is inscribed on the Australian National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux in France, one of nearly 11,000 Australian soldiers commemorated there. Back home, his grieving parents had the following poem printed in a Newcastle newspaper. A devoted son, a loving brother, one of the best that God could send. His true heart, his spirit brave, his resting place, a soldier's grave. Harry had left his miner's lamp at the Neath Hotel in the Hunter Valley. It still sits behind the bar there, and every year on Anzac Day it is lighted in his honour. Lance Corporal Joseph Henry Littlefair is listed on the Roll of Honour on my right, amongst 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. His photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Lance Corporal Joseph Henry Littlefair, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old as we the left grow old. Age shall not weary them nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning we will remember them. Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozieres or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and we wish you all a very good evening.